Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so you're trying to wrap your head around this whole Taiwan situation, right? And not just like the stuff you see in the headlines every day. You want to know the backstory, the deep history.
It's more interesting than you think.
Way more interesting,
Yeah.
trust me.
Yeah, buckle up.
We're talking about a time when this island, which, let's be real, most Americans probably couldn't have even found on a map back then, almost triggered World War III.
Twice.
Twice.
It's crazy how fast Taiwan went from being this kind of obscure place to like the center of this huge global showdown with communism. Almost overnight, it was central to U.S. strategy. It's wild.
Total 180. And it all goes back to the Korean War. Before that, America was, kind of taking this hands-off approach to Asia.
Right.
But then Korea explodes, and suddenly the spread of communism is this very real, very scary thing.
Yeah, the Korean War was a wake-up call, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It forced the U.S. to completely rethink like its whole approach to Asia. Suddenly, places like Taiwan, they mattered in a way they hadn't before.
And Taiwan especially became this critical line in the sand. Holding on to it meant containing communism, losing it. Well, let's just say the domino effect would have been massive.
Oh, absolutely. And that whole domino theory, it wasn't just some abstract idea for the folks calling the shots in Washington. It was a real fear. Like, if Taiwan falls, who's next? Does it ever stop?
So we've got this island, right? Recently become home to Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalist government after they fled the mainland. How does it become this global flashpoint?
Well, Mao Zedong, the big man in charge of communist China, he decides to poke the bear a little. He orders the shelling of these two tiny islands controlled by Taiwan, Quemoy and Matsu.
Tiny islands that were overflowing with symbolic importance.
Oh, totally. Imagine, right? You've just fled your homeland, set up a new government on Taiwan, and there you are, these islands are your last stand. And they're right there practically in China's face.
Talk about tense.
No kidding.
So Mao's lobbing shells at these islands, which, let's be honest, is a pretty clear message to both Taiwan and the U.S. How does Eisenhower respond?
Eisenhower basically says, back off, Mao, or we go nuclear. They called it Brinkmanship back then, this idea that you get so close to the edge of war, the other side has to blink. And it was as intense as it sounds.
It's hard to even wrap your head around today, right? World leaders just casually tossing around the idea of nuclear war as an option.
It's terrifying. But, gotta say, it worked. China backed down, crisis averted. But it showed everyone just how volatile the situation was.
And what's interesting is our sources actually disagree on just how close we really came to, full-blown nuclear war. One historian even suggests that Taiwan's leader, maybe he was playing up the threat a bit, trying to pull the U.S. further into the conflict.
It's like they always say, history is written by the victors. And even then, there are always multiple sides to every story. We'll probably never know for sure what was happening behind closed doors, but looking at those different viewpoints, that's where it gets really interesting. What we do know is that everyone involved, they were operating in this atmosphere of deep mistrust, fueled by ideology, fear, the whole 9 yards.
And that was just round one.
Right.
Fast forward a few years, 1958, and
There we go again.
it's like a bad sequel, except with even higher stakes, right?
Yeah, 1958, China's at it again, same islands, same tactic. But this time, it really drives home this point, that for America, this wasn't just about little old Taiwan. This was about sending a message to the entire region.
Like we're drawing a line in the sand here, folks.
Exactly. The U.S. couldn't afford to let another country, any country, fall to communism, even if it was just symbolic at that point. That domino theory was always in the back of their minds.
So Eisenhower's like, all right, let's double down on this whole Brinkmanship thing, even though, and this is where our sources get really interesting, his own Secretary of State, he's starting to sweat a little.
Oh, yeah, I bet. I mean, can you imagine
All this talk about nuclear war.
living with that constant threat? It really gets to the heart of what made the Cold War so tense. It's like every time they had to make a decision.
The fate of the world's hanging in the balance.
Exactly.
But the U.S., they're committed to this policy of containment. And it's not just about, rattling sabers. They want to isolate China economically, diplomatically, the whole shebang. So the second Taiwan crisis ends, what does that look like for China?
Well, put yourself in their shoes for a second, all right?
Yeah.
You've just been threatened with nuclear annihilation.
Yeah.
And on top of that, you're blocked from joining the United Nations.
Oh, and they also hit him with a trade embargo, just for good measure.
Can't forget that. It was a full court press. The U.S. was trying to, for lack of a better term, starve out the communist regime, hoping it would either collapse from within or at least stop spreading its influence.
So did it work? I mean, China's still communist today, obviously, but they didn't exactly take over Asia either.
Million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
Historians are still arguing about that one. The long-term impact of containment. It's complicated. On the one hand, yeah, it definitely stopped the immediate spread of communism across Asia.
Yeah.
And Taiwan, well, it's a democracy
It's
today.
a shining example of what the U.S. is trying to protect, right?
Exactly. But, and there's always a but, with history, it also created a whole lot of resentment. This wasn't just some minor disagreement. This was a major clash of ideologies, a global power struggle. And those wounds, they don't heal overnight.
It's almost like in trying to solve one problem, they ended up creating a whole new set of problems for down the road.
That's a good way to put it. And guess what? We're still dealing with those problems today, the U.S.-China relationship. It's more complicated, more strained than ever.
And you can trace it all back to these Cold War showdowns.
Without a doubt.
Okay, so we've mostly been talking about the American perspective on these crises, but did everyone buy into this narrative of, American heroism, the good guys fighting the evil communists?
Oh, absolutely not. That's where it gets really fascinating. Our sources lay out a whole spectrum of opinions on this.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. You've got your classic Orthodox view, right?
Yeah.
This is the traditional take on the Cold War. America as the defender of freedom, standing up to the big, bad communist bullies.
Classic us versus them.
Exactly. But then you've got the revisionists, and they're like, hold on a second, it wasn't that simple.
Okay.
They'd argue that the U.S., yeah, they weren't just some benevolent protector. They had their own interests at heart, especially when it came to, let's be honest, economics.
So less about saving the world from communism, more about, protecting their investments.
That's a big part of it, yeah. The revisionists would say the U.S. was using this language of, freedom and democracy to justify their actions, which, let's be real, often had more to do with maintaining their own global power.
And I imagine there are folks who fall somewhere in between those two extremes, trying to find some middle ground.
Oh, absolutely. And they're called, get this, the post-revisionists.
Catchy.
Right. So they're kind of like, okay, yeah, the U.S. definitely had its own agenda, but let's not forget, China wasn't exactly a helpless bystander in all of this. Mao had his own ambitions, his own vision for China. And what's really interesting is that after the Soviet Union collapsed, some of those Chinese archives opened up, and suddenly historians had this whole new perspective on Mao's decision-making.
So it's like peeking behind the curtain.
Exactly. Suddenly, Mao's motivations, they're way more complex than we thought. It's not just about spreading communism for the sake of it.
Okay, so to recap, we've gone from America, pre-Korean War, basically not really caring much about Asia, to almost stumbling into nuclear war twice over this island most folks couldn't have even pointed to on a map.
It's wild, right?
And we're not even done yet.
Not by a long shot. Because here's the real kicker.
Okay.
All of this is directly relevant to what's happening today.
Hold on. You're saying these Cold War showdowns, they're directly connected to the headlines we're seeing right now. So we're talking about these ghost stories from the Cold War, these moments when things could have gone nuclear. And you're saying it's not just history, it's directly relevant to what's going on between the U.S. and China right now today.
It's not even like those stories. It's the same story, different chapter. The tension, the U.S. commitment to defending Taiwan, China wanting control, that's what those crises were all about, and it hasn't gone away.
Except back then, China wasn't.
Well, China, not like they are now. We're not talking David and Goliath anymore. No, more like Goliath and Sod. Another Goliath, honestly. China's superpower now, economically, militarily. Any conflict would be on a whole other level of scary. And don't forget, it's not just about those two.
Oh, right. It's like that saying, when elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. But in this case, the grass is like Japan, South Korea.
Exactly. They're watching this very, very carefully, trying to figure out their own moves, who to side with, if it even comes to that, and the economic side of things. Don't get me started.
Taiwan makes all the computer chips, right?
Taiwan's basically Silicon Valley 2.0. Disrupt those supply chains. The whole world economy would feel it. We're talking a massive recession, at least. Probably worse. So yeah, knowing about those near misses in the 50s, it's not just, oh, interesting history. It's understanding the DNA of what's happening in the headlines today.
So what now? I mean, we've gone from this tiny island most people couldn't find on a map to almost blowing up the world twice. What's the takeaway? What have we learned?
If those crises teach us anything, it's that talking is good. Like really talking, not just posturing. Diplomacy, open communication, even a little humility wouldn't hurt. Finding ways to cooperate because the alternative is terrifying for everyone.
That's easy to say, but with all the baggage, the mistrust from all those years.
It's not easy, no argument there. But knowing we've almost screwed up this badly before, maybe that helps us make better choices now. It's like those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it, quotes. This time, repeating it could mean nuclear war.
Okay, now that is food for thought. So we've gone from a seemingly insignificant island to the brink of nuclear war and back again. Crazy how much the past can influence the present, huh?
It's all connected.
It really is. That's the beauty of a good deep dive, right? More questions than answers. It gets you thinking. If you want to understand the world today, you have to understand where we've been. And sometimes, the scariest part is realizing how much the past rhymes with the present.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.